Hi there, my name is Graham Wheeler. I am the post-production manager here for At the Helm. In today's episode, Dr. Charles Helm sits down with Chris Shi, a pharmacist turned medical student who has successfully put his type 2 diabetes into remission. They discuss Chris's journey, his struggles and his breakthroughs, and provide advice for anybody else hoping to combat chronic disease. Be sure to follow IPTN and check out their many resources like the Reversing Prediabetes site or the Diabetes Remission site, and follow At the Helm wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to At the Helm, the health podcast where we explore food as medicine and food as treatment for chronic disease. I'm your host, Dr. Charles Helm. I'm a family doctor who for more than 30 years has practiced medicine in the remote rural community of Tumbler Ridge, northern British Columbia. I'm also a paleontologist with a PhD from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. And I'm really privileged to be hosting this podcast from the traditional territory of the Treaty 8 First Nations in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. At the Helm is sponsored by IPTN, the Institute for Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition. And in today's podcast, I'm really excited to welcome Chris Shi. Now, Chris is a first-year medical student at UBC, the University of British Columbia. But he also has a Bachelor of Pharmaceutical Sciences. And before entering medical school this year, he worked as a community pharmacist, where he provided longitudinal care to patients. So with that background, Chris obviously is in a highly unique position to understand type 2 diabetes. And that in itself would form the basis of a fascinating podcast discussion. However, today we're going to talk with Chris about another facet of his life. Because aged 17, Chris received the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. At the time, his BMI, body mass index, was about 28, just a little bit high. And now, the amazing thing, at age 26, his type 2 diabetes has been in remission for 8 years, with attention just to diet and lifestyle choices, no medications. So today we're going to hear all about Chris's fascinating journey, and we'll ask him for some tips towards the end that he can share with others who may be confronting similar problems. Before I get to that, I would just like to have a necessary disclaimer, and that is that the information provided by myself or by Chris today, it does not constitute medical advice. It's not a doctor-patient relationship, especially for people who are on prescription medications, in particular, some that might be treating type 2 diabetes. If you're making or planning to make major lifestyle dietary changes, there can be untoward, unintended consequences, and some of the side effects could be severe. So the best advice is really just before you make any major changes to your diet, if you're on those prescription medications, just please talk to your healthcare professional first. So with that, it is now my great pleasure to introduce Chris Shi to you. Welcome, Chris.
Oh, thanks for that introduction. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this today. I feel like so much has changed with type 2 diabetes remission since I was diagnosed, and it's just very exciting to see all the new evidence and research that's been going into it. So really excited to be here tonight.
Well, that's great. And I mean, I think my first task is just to congratulate you for getting into medical school. I know at UBC this is not an easy task. I actually have sat on the assessors for the first year medical students trying to get into first year, and I know how tough it is. So well done. That's rather amazing. But my obvious question to you is, did your personal health challenges and health experiences have anything to do with you wanting to become a doctor?
Oh, absolutely. I think the age, just the age I was diagnosed when I was 17, very sort of transitional, critical period in my life. I'm just about to enter university where I'm trying to figure out my career. And, I was thinking back on it, and how much of an impact diabetes has had on not only my career, but my life, from, talking about wanting to be first a pharmacist, wanting to work in healthcare, and then eventually wanting to become a physician and now doing medical school. as well as changes to my diet and my lifestyle, going from more sedentary to, more active, as well as becoming more cognizant of the things I eat, reading packaging labels, doing research on what types of foods are better for my body. All of this stemmed from my diagnosis of type 2 diabetes and has really, really shaped me into the person I am today. So a huge, huge part of my life that I was reflecting over just before this podcast. So.
Yeah, and you've been a pharmacist. I mean, I'm just trying to put myself in your position, going through pharmacy school and learning about diabetes and medications to treat diabetes. That must have been quite an experience, but it just puts you in this unique situation where you go into medical school already incredibly well equipped.
Yeah, I think just working as a community pharmacist in the community, seeing people, who've had diabetes for decades, seeing people who are newly diagnosed, and just getting to engage in those conversations with them as well, and trying to help wherever I can. Very, very rewarding. So.
Yeah, so I'd like to come back to your medical school career and your history as a pharmacist towards the end. But first of all, I'd just like to focus on, that diagnosis of type 2 diabetes and what happened that led up to it. So if you can just maybe describe, in your teens, before the diagnosis, what was happening with your life? What were you eating? What were you doing in retrospect?
Yeah, so I guess leading up to my diagnosis, at the time, I didn't think there was, anything wrong with my diet. I was eating the normal teenage diet, so, not the healthiest, more on the junk food side, soda. I feel like at the time, now we know some of the consequences of, high fructose corn syrup and things high in sugar. But at the time, there wasn't very much information about it. So, high sugar diet, high carbohydrate diet. So not the greatest diet, that's for sure.
And did you have symptoms in retrospect? I know at the time you thought, well, this is okay, but in retrospect, A, did you have symptoms? And B, are there any risk factors that you can look back, okay, I was a sort of a sitting duck for this?
Absolutely. So pretty much as in my teenage years, for as long as I can remember, I had polyuria, which is, frequently going to the washroom. I was always thirsty, so I always wanted to drink water. And as well, I'd get muscle cramps at night, specifically my legs. So this was something that I realized later on in my pharmacy studies that could potentially be a symptom of hyperglycemia. So I did have lots of symptoms, and as well, I had high central adiposity, which means more fat in the stomach. So although my face and my legs and my torso looked on thin or on the healthier side, I had this glut of obesity in my gut. And again, this was something I learned in pharmacy school later. That was also a big risk factor for diabetes. So I definitely showed the signs. It was just making that connection. I didn't make that connection, and similar to my family, they thought it was something thyroid related. So you can imagine the shock when I found out it was diabetes.
And I guess if you were a typical teenager, maybe you weren't quite as physically active as you might have been.
Absolutely. I would say I was quite active, surprisingly. I played basketball, volleyball, badminton. I could run a fair amount, but I think just my diet probably overpowered the physical activity I was doing. So
Right.
I recall after class just going to Tim Hortons, eating 20 Timbits before, like an after school snack. And you can imagine my shock when later on I found out that each Timbit had 100 calories. So I was eating 2,000 calories as just a snack. So definitely some poor dietary choices at the time.
Right. So I can tell you that when I trained to be a doctor, which was quite a long time ago, I have to confess, but type 2 diabetes mellitus was it was pretty much unheard of in teenagers and youth. It was a disease of older adults. Not no more.
Mhm.
It's becoming epidemic, as we know, in adults, but it's the incidence and prevalence in teenagers is increasing quite alarmingly. It's really worrisome. And you've actually been through it, which is,
Mm.
on this podcast series, I've been interviewing expert researchers and expert clinicians, and they've all got a very important story to tell. But someone like you that's going into the medical profession, that's actually been there, and you're already at this young age, you've come through this. I mean, it's remarkable, and it's such an inspiring story. But what I'd like to hear is, okay, I think you said your mum or your parents took you, they were worried about thyroid or something, so they take you in, and then I'm assuming your doc does some tests and comes back with the verdict, you've actually got type 2 diabetes. So in the beginning, if I'm correct in thinking that's the sequence, but in the beginning, how did you feel about it? What did you do about it?
Yeah, so, like I've alluded to, it was definitely a big, big shock. Uh, I remember I was sitting in the clinic with my mom when the doctor came in and, told her and myself that I had diabetes. And, I didn't know much about it, to be honest. I just know that my great aunt had it, and she had, passed away from heart attack when she was quite young. So I was really, really worried about what this meant for me. I knew it wasn't good, just, based on the way the doctor said it. So quite a big shock. And aside from the shock, I also felt a lot of shame about my diagnosis. You mentioned at the time, still diabetes was considered an older condition. It wasn't something that happened to youth. And the general thought was if you, got it during youth is because you're overeating, you're obese, which, partly for me was true, but definitely added to sort of the stigma of being a young person with type 2 diabetes.
Did anyone explain to you at the time, or in the ensuing months, things like personal fat thresholds, genetic heritage, whether through your ancestry you might have been at slightly higher risk, even at a lower BMI, things like that? Or did you just accept everything that's happening to you?
Yeah, it's unfortunate because yeah, I just accepted what was it, uh, that wasn't really communicated to me at the time. I'm sure they're concerned about all the other things going on with how high my sugars were, so that might have been missed. But yeah, I do recognize how highly genetic type 2 diabetes is now. So
Yeah. And so did you right away then clean up your act and get onto a good diet? Were you put onto medications in the beginning? I also want to ask you if you recall what your initial HbA1c was.
yeah, I do recall it was 8.5%. So it was, on really, really quite high for someone my age.
Yeah.
And I had a conversation. So I had my first appointment with the specialist. We had a talk. He did want to put me on insulin right away, but recognizing that I was young, I did communicate that I was motivated to make changes, although I didn't know what the changes were yet. So I was just started on metformin, which is pretty standard medical therapy. And in terms of what I did after the diagnosis, I didn't clean up my act right away. I think some of that shame, that stigma really affected me mentally. So I did sort of have a spiral into not really a depressive episode, but definitely a lower point in my life where I just wasn't sure where to go with my condition. I thought that I would have diet or I'd be on medication for the rest of my life. This was just something where I'd have to continually take medication for, eventually get worse. You'd be on more medication, you'd be on insulin at some point. So, seeing this as a trajectory of the rest of my life was very, very tough for me to accept. So I think I definitely rejected it. I, continued some poor eating habits for a little bit of time. So it took me close to 6 months before I finally started to set my diagnosis and start looking into things that I could do to improve my condition.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to put myself in the position of your family doc or your specialist at that time. I mean, you're 17 years old, A1C of 8.5. I mean, going through my head, if I had you in front of me in my office, would be, could this be type 1? Could this
Yeah.
be some sort of hybrid between type 1 and type 2?
Yes.
Things like that. So there was work to be done, in
Mhm.
coming up with your diagnosis at the time.
Absolutely. My specialist did say it was they suspected late onset diabetes, so in terms of LADA for it. But they did think it was more of a type 2 presentation. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So, okay, so in the beginning, you're not really accepting this. You're almost rebelling a bit. And at some point, you're obviously going to realize, no, rebellion doesn't work. I've still got a problem I got to deal with. So was there a pivotal moment for you where, okay, all of a sudden I have this epiphany, I've got to change, I'm going to do something, or did it come on sort of gradually? How did, and what made you realize, no, I got to get serious about this. I got to do something?
I think after it's probably my second A1C blood work, wasn't improving. Obviously, I didn't make any changes, and just doing some more personal research into the long-term effects. So, going blind, issues with blood flow to your limbs where you might lose a limb, cardiovascular complications, all these things. And I realized I'm not going to let this, condition control me. I want to still be able to live my life. So even though I wasn't sure what I could do on my end to improve my condition, at the time I still thought, medications for the rest of my life. I told myself I was going to do everything possible I could on my side to change my condition and try to improve my health. So it was after seeing continually high A1Cs and some of those long-term consequences that, really hit home for me, and sort of a switch just clicked in my head. I need to do something about this now.
Right. So what made you decide, okay, I'm going to change the way I'm eating? Because I don't think, I mean, as a family doc, I mean, I was taught, yeah, diet and exercise are important, but, here's my confession. We were sort of taught that and we paid lip service to it. And, you might send someone to a dietitian, but we were really taught to focus on the medications and to start piling them up to try and get that HbA1c into the right zone, all that. And we didn't really pay attention to the diet and nutrition as nearly as much as we should have. And I now realize that. But so what got you thinking I can take control of this, and B, I'm just going to show people through what I'm eating that I can do it? Because I understand that's sort of
Yeah.
the thing you followed.
I say I didn't have quite that mentality because you're right. At the time, there's very little information about diet being able to even help with type 2 diabetes. Is mostly medication focused therapy. So being a young, I guess, more tech savvy teen and just looking around, Googling whatever I could, I did find a couple forums where mentioned people who had tried out ketogenic diets and finding that they were able to control their sugars with a ketogenic diet. So I started grasping at straws. I was like, okay, it worked for these people. Why not just try it and see what happens for me? So it wasn't more so like I knew diet was going to work right away. It's more so there wasn't very much information at all on the internet about what I could do. So the small things I could find, I thought, okay, let's try it and see what happens.
So you went onto a ketogenic diet of your own accord. No one recommended it. You chose that course for yourself?
Yeah, exactly. So looking back again, no consultation with a dietitian or my specialist. This was right after my specialist appointment, right? So I wouldn't see them again for 3 months. So I just started on it straight to ketogenic diet, less than 30 grams of carbs. Huge amount of, it was very tough because, what you have to, I was living at home still, right? So you have to sort of get your family on board too, into saying, hey, I'm going to try out this diet. And they're very, very supportive, although they didn't go a ketogenic diet, obviously, but they were very conscious about buying things that, I could use for my diet. But I did have to start finding recipes for myself and looking at the back of nutrition labels, planning out meals, looking at things like, okay, what is a carbohydrate count of every single piece of food that I eat?
So I'd love to hear how you felt on your ketogenic diet and what the things were that you cut out. And I think it is tough trying to keep it below 20 or 30 grams of carbs a day. I mean, it's not easy, but I'd love to know how it made you feel and the challenges that you had and how long you could keep it up. Because I think that's one of the challenges that some people have, is it's in the short term, it can work wonders, and then some people struggle to keep it up.
Absolutely. Yeah. So initially, I'd cut out all carbohydrates, and essentially my carbohydrate intake for the day would be a piece of bread and a protein bar. So I realize now I was not only on a ketogenic diet, but I'd call a very low calorie diet as well. So initially, how I felt, a lot of people mention keto fog, which is something I also noticed. So that's when you first start on a keto diet, usually for the first couple of weeks, you'll notice you're just not thinking as straight as possible. You feel like you're always tired. I definitely felt that. I also had hypoglycemia symptoms. So, sweating, rapid heartbeat. At the time, I didn't realize I was going hypoglycemic, but later when I talked to the specialist, I was like, okay, yes, I was going hypoglycemic. So I definitely a lot of keto fog, but I did get over it after a couple of weeks, sort of normalized, energy level sort of returned. And in terms of how long I kept up the keto diet for, I kept it up for 6 months. So as you mentioned, it is something very, very difficult to maintain long term, especially if you're not able to find other foods that can supplement your calorie intake. It could be quite challenging. So I transitioned to more of a lower carbohydrate diet after, once my A1C was more in the normal range. So I tried to target for roughly 100 grams of carbohydrates. I also became a lot more active during this period. So I recognized that ketogenic diet might not be sustainable long term if I'm going to start increasing my physical activity.
So where you are now, it sounds like you're still on a sort of a low carb diet. Is it omnivore, or what are you? You have a bit of everything, or are you vegetarian, or what are you doing?
I still eat meat. I find that I've you know now if I'm eating out at a restaurant, I do find that I go more towards the vegetarian options now. I'm not sure why, but um, like things like tofu or beans just I seem to gravitate more towards that now. As well, I found that desserts for me just um, I cut out all desserts essentially when I started on the keto diet, and even when I transitioned to low carb diet, not something I go for. Uh, I just find it, I guess the taste for me for the amount of calories just not worth it. So something I
Right.
skip out.
So if you have a setback, and I mean, we know we all have setbacks, we get stressed by life events and things. So if you have a setback, is the ketogenic diet still there in reserve for you just to get you back on track, or are you
Mm.
cool with your low carb diet?
No, I'm glad you brought that question up, because when I mentioned, I went from keto diet and brought my A1C down, it definitely wasn't smooth. It's a lifetime of eating habits is not something that goes away just because you want it to overnight. So lots of setbacks, binge eating. I was starting first year university too, so you can imagine the transition. I was living alone. Um, so definitely a lot of nights and days where my diet wouldn't be the best, would not be a healthy diet. But I think the important thing was, I didn't beat myself up too much over it. One bad day, okay, let's get back on track for the rest of the week. And even now, it's similar. Some nights, I won't eat as healthy as I should. It will be a higher carbohydrate day. And I just recognize that, it's a part of life. Diabetes is a long-term condition. It's a chronic condition. Um, and, one bad day in the grand scheme of things, even in a month, is not something you should beat yourself over. Just, pick yourself back up, focus again, and get back on the right track.
Yeah, I always tell people you can strive for perfection, but perfection is very elusive. So have the best of
Good quote.
intentions and things just go wrong on the way sometimes. But the
Mm-hmm.
point is to have the good intentions. But that's what I really appreciate about IPTN and its recommendations, because unlike other organizations, it doesn't tell anyone you have to eat this or this diet or this diet. So honestly, it doesn't matter if you're Mediterranean, vegan, vegetarian, carnivore, ketogenic, paleo, doesn't matter, but there are, for any of these diets, if they work for you, that's great. But here are the principles that you should follow no matter which of these diets you're on. These are the essential principles, and there are 8 of them, and we can put them up on the screen because they really, they're not that complex. So the answers are not that challenging and difficult. But I would like to ask you, given that and I'm assuming from what you're telling me that you made those changes, and you've been in what we call remission for 8+ years. So the definition, I think, the definition is that you're therefore no longer on medication. So the metformin must have been a temporary initial thing just to get you, help you on your way, but you're off your medications. May I ask you what your HbA1c is now?
Yeah, it's anywhere from 5 to 5.5%. So essentially, after I started on the keto diet, my next blood work after 3 months, it went from, mid 8s to 5.4, which, shocked my specialist at the time. They were worried that I was going to go too low. I'd also lost, roughly 40 pounds at the same time. So definitely more on the extreme side, but that's sort of what happens when I'm sort of winging it as a teenager on my own. But since then, I've kept it roughly within the same range. Some tests during college, during my undergrad, definitely went on, up to 5.8, 5.9. It did happen just, from the stress of being in school, I guess. But I've since controlled it then well within sort of the low 5s. So, and I'm happy at that range.
Yeah. And so I guess the other question to ask you, because we're talking about metabolic health here, and the same changes that you would institute to get your HbA1c down. And I have to say, going from 8.5 to 5.5, that is remarkable. Your specialist probably didn't recognize you when you walked into his office.
Very, very shocked. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely amazing. But I'm assuming that it didn't just happen on its own. There were probably other healthy lifestyle choices you were making. I'm not sure if you ever smoked, but with all your reading, I would imagine this is not a smoker. And alcohol would be very much in moderation or, at the low end, because it's difficult to be totally black and white, and there are occasions when a sip or two is a good thing. It's fine with friends, etc. But it shouldn't be certainly, to any on a regular basis kind of thing. But other actions in terms of exercise, what are your go-to sports that you enjoy doing? I think you've alluded to the fact that you did exercise a bit more too.
Yeah, so at the time, alcohol was a no just because of the carbs from it. But in terms, yeah, like you mentioned, when I did switch to keto, I also started, trying to be more physically active. So I picked up weights, for the first time in my life. I remember going into that gym the first time and picking up, 20-pound dumbbells, trying to bench press it and struggling. And, for context, it's quite a low weight, but it was something. So trying to be more physically active. So I still work out, but now I focus more on, I picked up rock climbing during COVID. And since then, I've just, fallen in love with the sport. So rock climbing is my main form of exercise now. And it's a great full body workout. I think a lot of people think you're just working on your forearms, but it's a lot of core tension. So it's a great workout for me.
Yeah, and is that in the gym or up in the mountains? Because you're living in a place which has got access to both of those.
Absolutely. So in the winters and the fall, I do stay indoors. But as soon as the summer hits, I try to go Squamish as much as I can and
Right.
enjoy the weather out there and the rocks
Right. Yeah.
in nature. So
For sure, because fresh air exercise beats the alternative any day.
exactly.
But so what I want to ask you, when you made these changes and you see your A1C coming down so beautifully, and for listeners that don't know the scale. I mean, 8.5, this is flagrant type 2 diabetes. And 5.5 is just lovely, beautiful in the normal range. So, I mean, it maybe doesn't sound like 8.5 to 5.5 is that much, but it is huge. But in terms of the metabolic effects, there'll be many people who they're going on to making these dietary changes in order to treat their diabetes, try and get it into remission. They're not necessarily thinking of their mental health. But these same changes, I mean, ultimately you're feeding your brain what it wants and what it needs. And in the end, many people will say that their mood, their mental state, less brain fog. I mean, you mentioned keto fog, but that's a short-term thing, I think. But many people will say that those things, as a bonus, they improved, and weight came off as a bonus. They weren't doing this to lose weight, but the weight just happened, pounds happened to come off. But their mood improved. So I was just interested if anything that you noticed in, well, I guess with your student days as well, concentration, studying, focus, if anything got better in that way.
Oh, definitely. And again, I'm very glad you brought that up because I think at the time, before I was diagnosed and before I'd made those changes, I'd always felt tired, always tired, lack of energy, lack of motivation. But because I didn't have anything to compare it to, I thought that was normal. Okay, this is just me. This is, I had nothing to compare it to. And it's only once I got my sugar in check, my A1C in line, I did have more energy. I felt more focused. I had more motivation. And, it showed in my grades. My first year grades were abysmal. And, I really credit, my improvement in my grades from getting my sugars in control and just feeling more energized, becoming more active. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I guess we need to tell all our listeners too that, I mean, remission is a wonderful term. It's a wonderful word. But with someone in your situation, I mean, you're doing so well, but the catch-22 is that if you go back to your old ways, it's going to come back. You haven't cured yourself. You've put yourself into remission, provided you keep on living your healthy lifestyle. So I think that's important for everyone to know, because people want to grasp this idea of cure. Well, no, what you've done hasn't cured you. It's put you into remission. And someone like you is so well motivated. You got your whole life ahead of you. I know you're not going to slip back, but I think it's important for people to realize that, yeah, if you just go back to your old ways, it's going to come back.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point to make. I tell everyone I have type 2 diabetes, right? I don't say, even though it is in remission, I don't say, I don't have it. It's a part of me. It's a part of my medical identity. And like you said, I am at a much, much higher risk for, relapse. So it's something that, I remind myself, okay, you still need to be careful. Although you're in remission, you still need to be cautious about your diet, still need to stay active, still need to make these conscious choices every day, to stay on a healthy diet. Every time I go to Costco, I look at the bakery, all the cakes, the tiramisu. It's very tempting, but it's during those moments you remind yourself, okay, you can't be having this. So
Right. So what I'd like to ask you is, you obviously, how many years is your pharmacy school, your degree? 4 years?
4 years, that's
4
right.
years, yeah, I thought so, yeah. So in those 4 years, how much were you taught about nutrition?
Um, During our formal courses for like our diabetes module, very little. So you mentioned lip service at the start. That was pretty similar. Try to avoid soda, get 150 minutes of exercise a week. But I did take a diabetes elective, um, which, was only open to 20 or so students. So it wasn't part of the general curriculum. And in that, I learned a lot more about diet and remission. We actually had Dr. Little, who is, very does a lot of research in this area, who gave a talk, which, helped a lot of students understand the role of diet and lifestyle in type 2 diabetes as well.
Yeah, so that's really good. I know in my medical school training, I did not get much information on nutrition, but that was a long time ago. I'm hoping, really hoping that nowadays medical students, pharmacy students will get, because I PT in, the mantra is food is medicine. So it's almost, there's a continuum between healthy food at one end, then food that's not so healthy and toxic food, and then we get to medications that can be used to treat the effects of those of the bad diet, etc. And we end up at the other end of the spectrum with giving large doses of insulin, and then that unfortunately has its own effects in addition to maybe bringing blood sugar down, but it promotes obesity and things like that. So it's a very complex field, and I just know if you just think in terms of the medications, you're looking at a very, very small part of the whole. And the more we can have our colleagues understand about nutrition, clearly the better. So I want to ask you, I think everybody that's listening to this is going to want to know, you starting out on your medical career now. Any ideas where you want to go? Do you want to become a diabetologist or an endocrinologist, or maybe a family doc that just sees lots of diabetic patients? Or do you want to just put this behind you and go into something totally different?
I've definitely thought about it. And, from working as a community pharmacist and getting to see, although I didn't work for, a huge period of time, just in the small time I worked, being able to see people on a regular basis, meet their families, just get to have those conversations with them. I know that I'm going to do family medicine unless something completely sways me. I'd love to be there for people that, they're first diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, or they're coming to me having had diabetes for an extended period of time, and just, providing them some, fresh perspective, some hope that I think the main thing for me when I was first diagnosed was I felt I had no control over it. I thought that, okay, the diabetes is going to control me. It has me in a chokehold, and I just do what, it does to my body. And I think just, letting people know that there are things that they can do on their end. They can still take control of their own life and make changes. I think that's so, so important for not just diabetes, but for other chronic conditions as well. Just for people to know that there's something they could do on their end. They're not just going to, let their condition take control of them.
Right. No, that's really important. Yeah. So I want to tell you about our pharmacist I'm in Tumbler Ridge. It's a small little place, but we had the most wonderful pharmacist who, and I'm mentioning this to you because you are a qualified pharmacist and you've worked as a community pharmacist. But so she, I believe, is sort of the new model of a pharmacist, where on a regular basis, there are medication reviews. There are attempts to get people off too many medications if they aren't too many. Looking at the risks of polypharmacy and the evils of polypharmacy, trying to avoid all those things. And I'm just so impressed because it's a whole new generation and a new approach to being a pharmacist. And so what we are hoping to do here in Tumbler Ridge is to get a point of care HbA1c meter that will be administered in the pharmacy. So rather than wait a long time to see your family doc, make an appointment, request an HbA1c, make an appointment in the lab, wait for the result to come back, another appointment to see your family doc. If you're motivated, because you want to know how am I doing and do I need to make change, that month or whatever it takes, however long the period is, it can be a bit demoralizing. It's hard to keep your motivation up. And here you'll be able to go into your pharmacy and say, can I have an HbA1c, please? And you get it. And 3 minutes later, you know the answer. And if it is slightly up in the pre-diabetic range, or they're going to be people who it's going to be in the diabetic range, then I think what we're trying to arrange here is that the pharmacist would immediately call the family doc and just say, look, this is what we've got. Can you see this person as soon as possible? And but it's putting a lot of the onus and the responsibility on the pharmacist. So I just mentioned that to you as a sort of innovation we're trying in this small little town. But get your thoughts on that. Well, how would you feel if you were the pharmacist and you were doing that?
I think it's amazing, especially in small communities. I'm sure you are quite overburdened, just with all healthcare, even, right? Pharmacists, nurses, physicians. So being able to take some of the burden off of you guys and administer tests that, we're comfortable and competent in administering and even providing some counseling on, I think that'd be wonderful. Even just to be able to spend more time with the patient and talk to them. Let's say their A1C is high, right? Like you mentioned, they may have to wait a couple of weeks. Some people even say a month just to see their family doctor. In that period, they're going to be nervous. So what should I do? What should I do? So, being able to speak to the pharmacist about it and knowing that, once you've done that test, you've built that rapport, they know that they can come to you for questions. So building that type of longitudinal relationship, I think is fantastic. And I'm not sure if you've seen, but BC has authorized pharmacists to order blood work now. So I'm not sure how that's going to work out yet, but it is something that's coming. So I think BC recognizes that,
Yeah, no, you're quite right. So ever increasing responsibilities and roles for pharmacists, which, I mean, from my perspective in a small town is partly because we've got such a wonderful pharmacist, but I think, power to them. And this HbA1c point of care thing is part of that. We realizing, probably 10 years ago, we couldn't have even tried it. It would have been illegal, as it were. But now everything is possible now, and in part because of all the challenges to the healthcare system, and there have to be innovative solutions. But the evidence for what you've done, I mean, I know you just Googled something and tried something on your own, but I mean, the evidence for the path that you've followed is so good. And so robust. And the challenge sometimes is just to get this message out to all of our colleagues and to healthcare providers and to health administrators and to patients and clients. This is possible. We know what, and I know what works and the potential of these interventions. And it doesn't mean that it works for everybody. There will be some people that can't get into remission, but even if they can get down from, let's say, 200 units of insulin a day to 20, and they get off some of the other medications, medications that are used for their type 2 diabetes, they're not technically in remission, but they are such success stories. So this is not to say that there are no people that need medications. Of course, some people with diabetes will still need medications. But, just the hope that this provides of taking control. So what I'm trying to ask you is, how do we succeed in getting that message to as many people as possible? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a tough challenge changing the status quo, right? Changing the conversation. I think what's being done with the Remission Possible website. So that's a group of researchers that wanted a central database that patients and healthcare providers could access. So that's been quite useful for me working as a pharmacist, because previously, when I'm having these conversations with patients about type 2 diabetes and talking about diet, and then they ask, where should I go? What should I do? And, I'm sort of at a loss of where to refer them to, because there really is nothing. So with the Remission Possible website, you go like, look here, there's this website here that you can access. It has Q&As, it has lots of information for you to read about. And there's also Lifestyle RX2, which is a local-based sort of like consult service for diet. So I also have mentioned them as well. So just having something that clinicians can refer people to as sort of a first step is huge. So I think those are some good steps that are being taken right now.
Yeah, and there's another website as well on reversing prediabetes. So because for every patient that we get an HbA1c back of, let's say, 7.3 or whatever, there's someone else with 6.2 and probably more. So, and there's also the notion of, you've got this kernel in the middle of people with diabetes, and outside of that, you've got prediabetes, and outside of that, you've got a much bigger group with insulin resistance, who are kind of just waiting in the wings to become pre-diabetic and then to become diabetic. And if one can alert them to the fact that they've got insulin resistance at a really early stage, then we're not even talking about remission, we're talking about real prevention, because catching at that point, we're really preventing anyone from getting to the point where we have to talk about remission, because they're not going to get there. So
Nope, you're definitely right.
But that's so exciting, it's why many of us, I'm saying this to you as a first-year medical student, but these are the things which motivated me to become a doctor in the first place, to actually make people better. And one of the other people we interviewed on this podcast series, Dr. David Unwin, he said, this is happy medicine because it's so fulfilling, and it's not just here we have another diagnosis that we can make, but we can't do that much about it. No, we can make enormous changes for people's lives here. So I thank you for those suggestions. It's very good. We have to get the word out. But so yeah, you've spoken to me about stigma. So you've upfront, there's embarrassment initially, there's stigma, but your underlying message very clearly is not about stigma, but it's about hope. And your messages are, you don't have to be on medication necessarily for life. You can try and take control. A, and B, you're not just going to have a better A1C, but you're going to feel so much better. I mean, it's just a win-win situation all round. So what I'd like to do finally, Chris, is just ask you, people must, you're at the cusp of your career here. You're in medical school, you're a pharmacist, you've been through your type 2 diabetes, you've come out the other side. You're such a success story, a role model. I'm sure people will see you as that, an inspiration. So I know that people are going to want tips or advice from you, just how do you make it work? And is there anything you can share with us?
Yeah, I guess I mentioned it in our conversation, but the biggest thing for me really was that we're gonna have, if you're going to try out a low carbohydrate diet or any lifestyle modification, you're gonna have bad days. That's just life, right? We all have our ups and downs, but it's so important not to beat yourself up over those bad days and spiral. If you feel like you're having a tough time, dealing with or picking yourself back up, go talk to your pharmacist, go talk to your dietitian, go talk to your doctor, and they could, try to help pick you back up. But just, it's all about the long-term control with this. One day or a few bad days from a stressful period are not going to cause permanent damage to your condition. And, it's very, very important that to focus on the long term. It's going to be years and decades. You have type 2 diabetes for life, right? So it's all about the long-term control. So I think that was what was the biggest thing for me that helped me focus for keeping these changes in place. Just remembering that, if I had an exam and, I ate a whole pizza for some reason, tomorrow's a new day. And, I'm going to pick myself back up tomorrow.
Yeah, well, Chris, all I can say is congratulations to you. You're inspiring on so many fronts. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I just want to wish you all the best in your medical career, which I'm sure is going to be stellar. You've got such a good head start on most of your colleagues, I would think. But not just in your medical career, but in keeping your type 2 diabetes in remission in the long term as well. We'll be putting those websites, links to those websites that you mentioned up, because I know one of those websites has got your story as well on it, for anyone that would like to read more about it. But thank you again. It's just been a pleasure chatting with you. And thanks to our producer, Anne Mullins. Thanks to our technical guru, Graham Wheeler. Of course, thank you to IPTN for sponsoring this whole podcast series. Once again, I'm Dr. Charles Helm. This is At the Helm that you've been listening to, and I have been interviewing Chris Shee. Really hope you've enjoyed today's podcast, and I hope that I can look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.